Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean text and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 181 of Lucretius Today. This week we're starting a new chapter in DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. We are moving on to chapter 14, which is entitled The New Virtues. This is the next to the last chapter in the book, and in this section he's singling out virtue and how Epicurus approaches the virtues as opposed to the way the Stoics or other philosophers also approach it. DeWitt reminds us that there are basically four classical virtues that Plato and Aristotle and other Greeks had referred to on a general basis, and those are wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice. And the point that DeWitt stresses in this opening section is the distinction between Epicurus's more individual perspective on the virtues versus more of a political focus, that Aristotle, Plato, everybody else was more focused on how the individual relates to the state and how he becomes a good citizen. And so the discussion of virtues was generally taking place in a different context before Epicurus. It was more related to becoming a good citizen than it was becoming a happy person. But before we get into that aspect of it, I'd prefer to drop back and discuss for a moment the word virtue itself. And when we talk about this new perspective on the virtues, we got to start with the question of what is a virtue? And how do we know what a virtue is? That will help us separate the perspective of Epicurus versus the others, because one aspect of it probably does include the question of whether a virtue has sort of an absolute and non-contextual character to it. In other words, courage, for example. Can you define courage as something that is going to apply in every situation? Or are you going to determine what is courageous in a particular situation by the outcome or the goal of what the person is doing when he engages in whatever it is he calls courage? But again, before we talk about the individual virtues, in general, what is a virtue?
I think it might be helpful to think about the word that's actually used in ancient Greek is arete, is the word that's usually translated as virtue. But the literal meaning is something more akin to excellence or the thing that best shows the character of something. Your arete is the way that you express yourself in the best possible way and that sort of thing. And other synonyms are things like character and reputation and virtue. But then, of course, we get into things like, manliness and prowess and generic things like goodness and excellence and that sort of thing. So it's a broad term. And I think whenever we get it translated as virtue, we get a lot of almost Victorian baggage that have to do with the virtues and that sort of thing. And so I think that it's an exhibition of the excellence of whatever you're doing. So the virtue of a spoon is that it can, lift things out of a bowl, that sort of thing. So there's a lot more connotations to it than just what we think of as virtue. But I think it's good to look at those four cardinal virtues that you brought up that we think of as exhibiting the excellence of character of someone or something.
Is this just another way of getting back into the same question of whether things exist in an absolute platonic ideal form versus just as a contextual combination of the atoms? Because Don, when you say excellence or the best, best in relation to what? Excellent in relation to what? Is there a single absolute example of the best to which we can refer, especially in something as broad as a word like wisdom or courage or justice or temperance?
Yeah, at least according to Aristotle, it seems like he was definitely believing that the virtues were something you could learn. And it seems to me he also always comes back to the idea of what's good for the polis, what's good for the city-state. How do you show your excellence in relation to the city-state? And it always seems to come back to that idea for him. So I think that Epicurus comes at it from a more maybe individualistic perspective, because for Epicurus, the virtues are instrumental to pleasure, whereas it seems for Plato and Aristotle, these are things that can be examined in and of themselves. And so, do you have courage or not? Do you have, wisdom or not? And that is sort of a system of study that you can look at, where Epicurus is saying, well, the virtues are important, but they're only important in that they are instrumental to a pleasant life.
I think this is such an important way to introduce our discussion of the virtues that I really would like to get input from the rest of our panel. Joshua, Martin, Calasini, let's talk about this, because the way Don ended up right there, I think is pretty much the way I think I see it myself, that you have to decide what is your fixed point of reference before you can evaluate whether something is wise or temperate or courageous or just or honest or anything else. But that seems to be something that people don't talk about that much. They seem to just presume that there is some wisdom floating in the air, or courage floating in the air, or justice floating in the air, without reference to how they're deciding whether it does have that quality or not.
I think it's helpful, Cassius, to look at the root of the word virtue, which Don hinted at. It's this word for man. It's vir, or wir is how it would be pronounced, I think. And so the idea is that the virtues are the behaviors that you are meant to imitate in good, real Roman men, I think, is the idea there. And that to not follow these virtues would be to make you suspect as both a Roman and as a man. So that's the root of it, I think. It's the proper behavior for good, upstanding Roman men, the behavior of people who, for example, put the interests of Rome ahead of their own interests. And how you get that is, I think, partially from looking at, again, the men around you, but part of it is the stories they would tell each other. So there's a story about a Roman hero called Cincinnatus, which, of course, the city of Cincinnati is named after him. And he was in politics, but then he had retired to his villa or his country estate and taken up a life of simple farming. Then something happened, and there was some threat that was affecting the city, and they needed a really good, strong leader to take care of the situation. So they sent messengers out to Cincinnatus's farm, and he sees them coming. He won't talk to them immediately. He's got to go back in the house and put on his toga and do the proper thing. And then he comes back out, accepts their invitation. Roman law had a provision that you could make one man a dictator for a period of, I think it was 1 year or 9 months or something. So he becomes a dictator under Roman law, drives the threat away, and then before his term is even up as a dictator, he takes off the toga and goes back to his farm. And that's the classic image. And throughout history, people like George Washington and their admirers have used that image to describe the people that they're trying to compare to Cincinnatus. The main point comes from analyzing the stories, not just of heroes, but also of gods, people like Hercules, for example. You're meant to look at these people who are said to be the pattern of such and such a virtue and to emulate that in yourself. That is the classical idea, I think, of virtue. And of course, I think Don is completely right. When it comes to the Epicureans, the virtues are instrumental and subservient to pleasure. And that would be the main difference, I think.
So Joshua, when you're talking about Roman men and doing things that are virtuous in the eyes of the Roman citizens or the eyes of the Greek citizens in the case of the Greeks, that's an interesting way of looking at the fact that virtue, when you dig deeper into it, you come back with almost what I think Brutus said after he was defeated at Philippi, something about I believed in you as if you were real, but in the end you're just a mirage, basically. There doesn't seem to be anything firm and solid if what you're looking at is just taking a survey or a poll of what the most admired leaders of the particular civilization are doing. And yet, when you read about virtue today on the internet, when you hear about what the Stoics are thinking about, especially modern Stoics, they throw out this word virtue as if it exists somehow handed down by God. And I'm reminded there's a recent book out there by the Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri. His book is based on this idea, manhood, I think is the title, that there is some intrinsic virtue in being a man. And in this case, he's talking gender, but we're also talking wider, just in being a human. It's not necessarily just limited to men versus women. There's this whole idea of that there's some kind of an absolute form of virtue that everybody should aspire to. And that if we think about it hard enough, the definition is just somehow floating there in front of us. It seems to me they do use examples nowadays of virtues, but they're talking and acting as if these examples themselves, Cincinnatus himself, was just following some ideal that existed prior to him. And you've got sort of, again, this infinite regression question of where does this come from in the first place? And I think that's a large part of our discussion here is that Epicurus is questioning, just like he's questioning where the universe came from and questioning the idea of chaos, he's questioning what is the foundation of virtue and what is it solid that you can build it on and be confident of your conclusion about it. If you're just taking a poll of what people do in Rome versus Greece versus England versus Russia versus the United States, you're going to come up with a pretty wide variety of things that the leading citizens of San Francisco in 2023 are probably doing a little bit differently than the leading citizens of London in 1823.
People can also give the veneer of permanence and getting the virtues from on high by the mere fact of capitalizing the first letter of some of these. So, capital V virtue, a capital W wisdom, that sort of thing, capital C courage. And it can give the veneer with there is like, oh, well, there must be some sort of, proper noun this is called courage and that sort of thing. I thought it was interesting that Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics says himself, he says, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. This truth is attested by the experience of states. Lawgivers make the citizens good by training them in habits of right action. This is the aim of all legislation, and if it fails to do this, it is a failure. This is what distinguishes a good form of constitution from a bad one. And I think that there he's saying that it sort of goes round and round. It's like if you become just by doing just acts, well, who's saying what acts are just, and where you're getting your definition of just there as well? Where are you getting your definition of temperate? So it's one of those things where it comes back to, if you try and discuss these things in a vacuum and just talk about, the capital V virtues, it's like, where are you getting your definitions? And I think that's where Epicurus comes in handy, where he says that, his idea of, a natural justice is to neither harm nor be harmed. And if you use that as a definition, it's like, oh, okay, well, that at least is a concrete thing that you can observe. Whereas if you just say, God says that, courage is this, or the state says that courage is this, and that sort of thing, goes back to almost the whole 1984 where war is peace and freedom is slavery and that sort of thing, where the state sort of redefined the words and said what it was going to be. And whereas Epicurus is taking a very concrete sort of action you can look at, neither harm nor be harmed. And it's like, oh, okay, well, if we use that as a starting point, we can use that as a reference for other things that we talk about.
It's that old problem, Don, of which came first, the chicken or the platonic egg of the chicken.
Exactly.
It might be good at this moment to remind everybody that, of course, we're about to have a discussion of a chapter entitled The New Virtue. And Epicurus does not discard the name of virtue. He does not discard the whole concept of virtue, but he ends up in a very different place. Again, I think that we could hit this even harder, and we probably should, because we should never miss an opportunity to distinguish Epicurus from the Stoics and from other adverse groups. This is a huge, huge issue, because when you hear Stoics talk about their techniques, these Stoics, they don't hesitate from going all the way. They say virtue is its own reward. Virtue is all you need. Virtue is everything. And if you read these texts, you see how they double down on it and how a modern Stoic can continue to hold to these positions without acknowledging that it's ultimately a religious or faith-based position that is ultimately contingent on there being some God that created the prototype of it in the first place. It strikes me as just something that's really important for people to think about. When they think about what they read on the internet about the techniques of therapy, Arthur Nussbaum's The Therapy of Desire is written from the Stoic perspective of how these virtues are going to help you. But in the end, what people are reading that book for is they want to be happy and they're looking for happiness. Well, virtue has to be grounded in happiness as the goal, or else it has no meaning of enduring form other than what the leaders of your particular society are doing at a particular time. It's hard to believe that people find that kind of an argument compelling once they start thinking about it.
There's your thing, too. If you start thinking about stuff, then there's your problem right there. It's like, just take it on faith.
Interestingly enough, we're going to have a section on faith here in this chapter in which DeWitt talks about Epicurus having a form of faith in the sense of confidence based on evidence. But there's also this blind faith, the idea that you should have faith despite there being no evidence. You should have stronger faith because there is no evidence. Again, each one of these terms is something that you can go through and unwind the common definition of it and then put it in a different framework.
One more thing I can say in sort of a general way is that taking, say, the emperor of Rome as your model or the hero of your Greek city-state as your model, in the ancient world, they had this practice, which we now call the damnatio memoriae. And they didn't use that phrase, but it's this interesting problem that if you're a Roman emperor, right, and you are supposed to be something beyond merely mortal, and if your laws are to carry divine decree and so forth, but the last guy to hold your position did everything wrong and didn't behave at all like you think he should have behaved, then you would issue this damnatio memoriae. Again, they didn't use the phrase, but every reference to his name would be scratched off of every statue, off of every monument, off of every public building that he suborned. And so by completely purging his existence, I thought of this because Don mentioned 1984, that it really becomes, this whole issue of virtue becomes very malleable in the hands of this authoritarian state. Now, that might be closer to politics than we want to go, but it seems like it's worth keeping in mind, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Justice is a prominent feature of the last 10 principal doctrines of Epicurus, and he talks about it regularly. And while we stay away from contemporary partisan politics, the background issue of what is justice and so forth are definitely things that were important to Epicurus and are important for us to think about, at least from a philosophic perspective, as opposed to deciding who to go out and vote for tomorrow. We'll leave that to the listeners to decide, but we certainly can have wide-ranging and deep opinions on the issues that lead you into how to make those decisions. Going forward, just briefly, my eye was caught by one of DeWitt's phrases that sometimes jumps out as being semi-humorous. But what DeWitt does is point out that if you're not going to look at the leading citizens of Rome or the leading citizens of Athens as your guide, what would Epicurus look at in the place of that to determine what virtue might be? And DeWitt reminds us that what Epicurus tells us is that you look to the young of all kinds of animals to determine what they are doing before they become corrupted or perverted or warped by errors, which implies bad philosophy or bad religion and so forth. And DeWitt uses the phrase in this, comparing it to Christianity, where, of course, the Christian would say, well, that's not going to help you to go back to what a baby does because we're all born with sin. We're born in sin. We're born with original sin. And what DeWitt says here is that Epicurus created by implication a doctrine of what may be called original honesty. He says to preserve this natural honesty became the main objective of the new education, and the virtue of honesty was raised to a status of prime importance. The point being that what Epicurus was attempting to do in looking back at the way animals live before they are corrupted is, to the extent that there is an objective way of looking at the way things live, that does provide you a base that you can look at honestly. And you're not going to conclude, as a Christian might, that we are born in sin. Neither are you necessarily going to look at them and believe that they are born as good, whatever good means, or blessed by God, or doing things in a good way. What you're doing is just looking at them as they are, as best you can, objectively and honestly, in determining that what they do is pursue pleasure and avoid pain.
I was going to say, this is the emperor has no clothes moment for Epicurus, because what he's really saying by looking to nature not yet perverted for the norm, rather than to reason, rather than to God, rather than to the state, anything like this, he's totally undercutting the philosophers, he's undercutting the priests, the oracles, all these entrenched groups that are normally the arbiters of what is good and proper and what is not, what is right and what is wrong, what is virtuous and what is weak and cowardly and beggarly. He's totally stripping them of any power that they might otherwise have to set the tone in the conversation. And he's restoring all of that power back to its rightful place, which is nature. It's nature that we derive this information from, not this guy who happened to bribe his way into the right position in government. That's not the focus.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to put it as well. It also seems to me, at least, to be focused back on the individual as opposed to the state.
Yes, definitely.
Now, we're still in the opening section, and he's going to go more deeply into this, but at this point in the discussion, DeWitt mentions this issue of faith and says that faith is a virtue with Epicurus. What DeWitt says is that it was the shift from skepticism to dogmatism that made a virtue of faith. Dogmatism meant assertion of the possibility of knowledge, and Epicurus believed his teachings to be true philosophy. Again, I'm not so sure the right word there is faith as much as it is confidence or some other word. And this is the point we talk about in canonics, and I contrast it with Francis Wright. This question of it's one thing to make observations, and that's the important first step. But then there's this question of coming to a conclusion based on the observation. And skepticism is to some extent a position that you can never come to a conclusion. You're never going to be confident in making a prediction about something because you just have to experience it and then see what happens. But Epicurus is definitely willing to go further, and I wouldn't call it faith because I can't disassociate the word faith from the term blind faith. When I hear faith, I hear blind faith. I hear belief without evidence as the definition of the word faith. But in the sense of faith being, I have faith in Epicurus to give a good assessment of something, that would mean I have confidence in Epicurus based on my reading of him in the past or based on just observation of things, that the conclusion that he's going to come to is worthy of taking action on. If you want to take that extreme reductionist position, you don't know that the world's going to exist 2 seconds from now. When you move your foot in a particular direction, it may just disappear. And of course, you move your feet anyway because you have confidence that the world is not going to just disappear at any particular moment. You have confidence when you put on your brakes that your car is going to slow down. And you live your life based on confidence, based on evidence. And while you can use that word faith if you like, it's a different concept than the religious faith.
Yeah, and I think DeWitt does a good job of defining dogmatism there. I like his assertion of the possibility of knowledge, because I think a lot of people hear that word dogma and dogmatism, and the Epicureans were dogmatic in that they, laid down the law and everybody had to believe exactly what they said and that sort of thing. But I think that the whole idea, at least in the text, it seems it contrasts with skepticism, that the skeptic said that you couldn't and shouldn't come to conclusions, whereas Epicurus said, no, we can assert knowledge after we have the evidence for something, and we don't have to go through our lives saying it's like, I don't know. So it seems like that definition that DeWitt gives there, I really like that, with that assertion of the possibility of knowledge.
Does anyone know, maybe I'm not reading it correctly, at the top of page 290, DeWitt says this. He says, his utterances enjoyed the status of divine oracles, and he provided his disciples with 40. And he goes on to say, unluckily, not 39 authorized doctrines.
I've never known what that means. Joshua, do you have a guess?
Well, the Anglican Church has its 39 articles of religion finalized in 1571.
Oh.
I'm sure it comes from something like that, but I just have no idea.
But if the Anglican Church has 39, and of course DeWitt's professor in Canada, and I kind of presume the Anglican Church is strong in Canada, maybe that's the reference.
That is exactly it, Joshua. I think you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, finalized in 1571. Yeah. Gold star for Joshua. That's exactly right. I see no way that there could be anything else.
I presume DeWitt judges it to be unlucky because it somehow restricts him from making another parallel to Christianity or something.
Yeah, because he would like it to have been 39 because then it was the 39 articles. Yeah, because they're literally called the 39 articles. So
I did not know.
And that's why he has the capital A there for articles in that line that follows it. Your erudition never ceases to amaze me, Joshua. Nicely done. That's
excellent.
Well done.
I'm going to have to jot that down so I can remember it 20 years from now.
Yeah. I was convinced I would never know the meaning of that.
Here on page 290, DeWitt writes, while the good Platonist, like the Christian, lived in contemplation of immortality, the Epicurean was taught to live in contemplation of mortality. The chance of achieving happiness was narrowly confined to the interval between birth and death. This had the effect of bestowing great urgency upon the business of living rightly. Procrastination became the greater folly. So this is the urgency with which we are meant to approach this issue of the virtues, and finding out the ground on which they stand becomes an incredibly important issue.
No, that's a good thing to pull out. That's a good line to pull out there. I fully agree. Yeah.
And that may be something that he does not cover as he goes into detail of the particular virtues, because this is a general consideration. And I agree too. This is extremely important. I've always thought that this idea of the recognition that life is not a prelude to an eternity in heaven is one of the most profound positions you can take. It's not a warm up. It's not a preparation. It's not something you're getting
sort of thing.
A dress rehearsal. Absolutely. This is it. And if you really truly are convinced of that, It's really hard for me to see how you can justify not acting as rigorously as you can while you do have the time. There's all sorts of cliches. I remember make hay while the sun shines, kind
Yeah.
of, because the sun does not continue shining forever.
All right, are we ready for some wisdom now? Because
Yes. Yes, let's
Good
move
segue. Nicely done. There you go.
exactly. We're going to keep that in for sure. Let's move to the next subsection
And
entitled
capital
Wisdom.
W, wisdom. Thank you very much. La-di-da.
Exactly. And DeWitt makes the point that in Plato's version of things, wisdom is associated with the rational part of the soul, and its highest activity was the study of mathematics. And in ethical and political investigations, its instrument was dialectic, both of which Epicurus ends up de-emphasizing in Epicurean philosophy.
this is totally irrelevant, but one thing I'm noticing here in the way that DeWitt writes this book is I'm thinking of people who talk about like chakras and so forth, and they'll say that this is the water chakra. It's located at the sacrum or whatever, and it's cleared by joy, but it's closed and inhibited by fear or whatever. The way he's writing it, I strikes me as kind of interesting. Each virtue, in other words, has, how does he phrase that? The thing that identifies it, but also the thing that stands in the way of it.
Yeah, there seemed to be a lot of that, especially with like Aristotle and that sort of thing. And even Philodemus would take like the virtue and then contrast it with the corresponding vice and, how to get better at one and try to get rid of the other one, that sort of thing. So it seems to be a common trope that is available to people whenever they write this sort of stuff. It's all in the application, I guess.
And then we get into this weird issue of Plato, whether men can be hypothetically classed into gold, silver, and iron, and how Epicurus deals with that, and this issue of Epicurus calling Plato the golden. So the central argument, this is called the great lie of Socrates or something like that. What he says is that in the formation of a city or a state, we should lie to people. We should tell them that by nature, by God, by natural right, or whatever it is, people are classed into three different classes. You've got the golden people, and those are the people who have the divine right to rule. And then you've got the silver people, and those are the people who are the aristocracy or the senators or whatever you would plug in there. And then you've got the iron people, and those are at the bottom of the scale. And the reason that the iron people can never become kings is because they weren't born golden. So that's the issue. How does that relate to wisdom? I guess
Isn't that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Isn't that a convenient categorization of people too? That's.
I remember, because I have a degree in history, one of the things we always talked about when we were talking about any pre-modern period, essentially, is that you've got this tripartite struggle between three different groups, the king, the aristocracy, and the church. And that it wasn't really until you had the so-called fourth estate with urbanization that you can have any hope of breaking out of this medieval system. But the nature of having three parts is that it will always require basically two of them in alliance to subdue the third. But then the third one will always make an appeal to one of the other two to peel them off of the alliance. And that's how you have this constant ongoing struggle for power, for land, and that really marks the structure of government in the Middle Ages. Now, that might be too cute by half, but it is certainly taught that way, even at the college level.
Yeah, moving down, I guess, towards the end of that wisdom section, I do think it's interesting, or at least, important to bring up the whole idea of phronesis and practical wisdom as opposed to just wisdom for capital W, wisdom for its own sake. And I think that's one of the things that I like the way, I can't believe I'm saying this today. I like the way DeWitt writes that about the greatest good in the beginning of all the virtues. And he talks about phronesis being the sort of the basis of it. And Epicurus himself talks about the, phronesis and practical wisdom is sort of the beginning of all wisdom and that sort of thing. And it makes sense because of the idea that through practical wisdom that you make your decisions about what you're going to choose and what you're going to reject and what paths you're going to take and that sort of thing. So phronesis or practical wisdom is sort of the basis for all the other choices that you're going to make, because that's where you start out making your choices and avoidances. And I will say I never really thought of it that way, but I can see that that's one of the reasons I think that Epicurus can talk about practical wisdom that way.
Yes, it's almost like that is Epicurus's answer to something we read way earlier in this book, which is the Platonic approach of pure reason contemplating absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's not pure reason and it's not absolute truth.
Right.
It's practical reason, and it is nature and human life, and
Yep.
and that's the focus.
Exactly.
That's a good point, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can quote DeWitt's exact sentence on what Don was talking about. He says, quote, in place of the grandiose notion of wisdom identifiable with pure reason and divinity and existing apart from mankind, Epicurus chose to exalt the practical reason, phronesis, which was the greatest good and the beginning of all the other virtues. So as we go through each of these, and we're going to go through a whole series of these virtues, wisdom is the first one. Let's be sure as we go through each one, let's make sure we're clear about what was the prior or incorrect view of wisdom. And then again, instead of just jettisoning the idea of wisdom, what is the view that Epicurus came up with? And one way to summarize it would be just basically what DeWitt said, that Plato, Aristotle, these other guys were sort of deifying wisdom as if it existed in the air or on its own, as if there was some reference point of wisdom somewhere outside of us that we should look to emulate. And they romanticize this as being golden, or people who are able to do it as being golden people. And there's, again, romanticization of an abstracted form of reason or logic that appears to be a lot of what's going on. I recall it from reading years ago in Ayn Rand. She was very focused on being rational. She was a modern version of these people, almost like the Stoics, who consider rationality to be the distinguishing feature of being a man, being a human. And therefore, the development of rationality should be the key aspect of determining how to live. And so no matter what perspective, old or new, you come from, this deification, making a god of reason, which I think the modern Stoics also are guilty of, is something that Epicurus absolutely rejected because there's not a firm foundation for it. And in place of this grandiose notion of wisdom, Epicurus was erecting a practical wisdom, prudence, whatever different words you'd like to describe it as, which is a sort of practical ability to work with facts, work with evidence, work with observation, reasonably process them to produce the goal, which is a happy life. And that process is very validly considered to be prudence or wisdom or given a name of its own. And so Epicurus pronounces his version of wisdom to be extremely important while rejecting the prior version.
And I think it's important to remember that the word philosophy itself literally means the love and practice of wisdom, Sophia. Mm-hmm. And he uses the word philosophy throughout his writings. So I think it's good to get a handle on what he actually means whenever he says wisdom. And I really do think it is that practical application of wisdom.
Right. Okay, so let's move to the next category, which always evokes in my mind pictures of 1920s women crusading against alcohol. Temperance is the word. What is it? The Women's Christian Temperance Union or something was very famous back. I guess it's the 20s, campaigning against alcohol. So I'm not even sure that temperance is the right word. It doesn't really convey today exactly what this virtue probably is. How would you guys describe it in other words? It's not exactly moderation, is it? Or self-control?
I think either of those get a better view of it. DeWitt does sometimes use some more Victorian sounding terms, even though he wasn't a Victorian. He uses that sort of older language sometimes, like with temperance and stuff like that. But I think, self-control, moderation, that sort of thing. I think it gets at what at least I would consider it to be.
Yeah, that's the second dictionary definition, is the quality of moderation or self-restraint. The word comes from the Latin temperare, which means restrain.
So you're restraining your desires or that sort of thing.
And what he says here is that in Platonic philosophy, Plato relates this to his tripartite view of the soul. And temperance in his philosophy concerns the appetitive part of the soul. And so the problem, I guess, centers on this idea that you are intemperate in satisfying or pursuing your desires. And so even though this isn't something that we talk about a lot, we do kind of talk about it under other headings, like the heading of desire and the different forms that desire might take. So that might be an angle on this.
Is DeWitt referring there to like the charioteer and the two horses, and you have to control the horse of your desires and the horse of your reason and get them to work together, that sort of thing? Is that what he's referring to?
That's a good question. This whole idea of being equally yoked.
Right.
DeWitt includes the whole discussion of the natural and necessary desires under this heading.
And this is also, I think, where we have to be careful, too, about falling into the whole idea of, Epicurus as an ascetic and limiting his desires to only enough to keep him barely alive and that sort of thing. And that's one of the, I think, the things that Emily Austin did so well in her book was to sort of squash that trope in the same way that she sort of crushed the trope of, that he was a hedonist and sex, drugs, and rock and roll all the time. I really, whenever I say things like that, I really don't want to like get down the whole idea of the Platonic or Aristotelian, middle way or the middle path or even a Buddhist sort of thing, that because I think it can be interpreted that way. But I think having those two extreme stereotypes of Epicurus in mind and then realizing that neither of them are really true, I don't want to get the idea across that we're talking about some sort of, the middle way or that sort of thing. So I think moderation and self-control and that sort of thing, I think is a positive trait. But I think we have to be careful how we couch it in the terms that we use, especially in light of other philosophies and other religions and things like that.
DeWitt says here on page 292, he says, this virtue of temperance is not even mentioned in the extant writings of Epicurus. And then in very DeWittian style, he follows it up with this, although he must have discussed it in the role above mentioned, which we don't have.
There we go. Now I can get down on DeWitt again. Okay, good. Now we're back to my normal modus operandi. Okay.
Yes, Don is back to his golden mean now. DeWitt then goes on to say, he says, its Platonic context meant nothing to him for two reasons. First, he rejected that threefold tripartite division of the soul that I was mentioning. Along with this, he rejected the subjection of the desires to the rational soul. And second, he looked not to reason, but to nature as his norm. That's the constant theme throughout this book. And it's reason, it's nature, not reason, that really sets limits to desires, I guess is the end there. And then he goes on to say, as for the political setting, Epicurus could not have destroyed it, even if he had wished, but he did diminish its importance by confining his teaching in Athens to private property. So it's like Don was saying earlier, it's less that political ambition that marks so much of this early thought of Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was a lifelong mentor to Alexander the Great. It's this issue of focusing on the individual and even more on the social aspects of it rather than the political aspects of it or the geopolitical aspects of it.
DeWitt is going to proceed from here and talk for a moment about how the natural and necessary classification falls under this category as well. But before we get to that, as we go through this, I've been constantly trying to refer to the Torquatus discussion in book 1 of On Ends, because it's interesting. We're laughing about how DeWitt says that Epicurus himself does not talk about temperance. But it's interesting to see that Torquatus does specifically go on at some length about the topic of temperance, and probably just for the purpose of helping gel in our minds what it is that these guys were thinking temperance means. Let me read this Rackham version from section 14 of On Ends, book 1. He's just been discussing wisdom. And that's another thing before I read that. I have a hard time in my mind separating sometimes the difference between wisdom or prudence versus temperance. I mean, what's the difference between prudence and this idea of self-control that we seem to be talking about? Maybe this helps a little bit to read what Torquatus was saying. He says, quote, the same principle will lead us to pronounce that temperance also is not desirable for its own sake, but because it bestows peace of mind and soothes the heart with a tranquilizing sense of harmony. We probably need to be discussing temperance in regard to catastematic and kinetic and these other things we talk about. Then he goes on, for it is temperance that warns us to be guided by reason in what we desire and avoid. Nor is it enough to judge what is right to do or leave undone. We also need to abide by our judgment. Most men, however, lack tenacity of purpose. Their resolution weakens and succumbs as soon as the fair form of pleasure meets their gaze, and they surrender themselves prisoners to their passions, failing to foresee the inevitable result. Thus, for the sake of a pleasure at once small in amount and unnecessary, and one which they might have procured by other means, or even denied themselves altogether without pain, they incur serious disease or loss of fortune or disgrace, and not infrequently become liable to the penalties of the law and of the courts of justice. Those, on the other hand, are resolved so as to enjoy their pleasures, so as to avoid all painful consequences therefrom, and who retain their faculty of judgment and avoid being seduced by pleasure into courses they perceive to be wrong, reap the very highest pleasure by foregoing pleasure. Similarly, also, they often voluntarily endure pain to avoid incurring greater pain by not doing so. This clearly proves that intemperance is not undesirable for its own sake, while temperance is desirable not because it renounces pleasure, but because it produces greater pleasure. So I think it's an interesting discussion of how temperance fits in with this whole issue.
Yeah, I agree. The phrase that ran through my head as you read a couple of those passages there was, I can resist anything but temptation is what it sounds like. And the whole idea of temperance is that you actually do resist temptation for things that are going to bring you pain.
How is that different from the wisdom of knowing that you should resist temptation? Is there something about this temperance that's a quality of character that, like I said, again, almost reminds me of some of our catastematic discussion? It seems like it's an attitude as much as it is a...
Yeah. Well, I guess you bring up a good point there. Are the virtues feelings? Are they emotions? What is a virtue? So how's that for throwing a monkey wrench into the discussion here?
Back where we started from. Yeah,
exactly.
But thankfully, Joshua will answer that question for us, right, Joshua?
It couldn't be more patently obvious to me that virtues are simply instrumental behaviors that we pursue in desire to get a fuller and more enjoyable and better sense of the good. And I don't see why that's unclear to anybody.
Well done. Well done.
Well spoken. Yes.
Now, the actual answer is I don't really know how to fully slice this in all the different ways that are necessary. And like Cassius said, trying to chart the intricate and almost difficult to discern similarities between things like temperance and prudence and wisdom. And I don't really know where all that is meant to be demarked. But I do think that in general, the issue is pretty clear, the differences that Epicurus takes to the rest of these ancient philosophers, which I guess to me is the main point.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Yep.
And before we move on, I'll pick out one sentence of what Torquatus says, where he says, quote, "Nor is it enough to judge what is right to do or leave undone. We also need to abide by our judgment." So maybe prudence and wisdom, to some extent, is the reasoning process by which we know what it is we're supposed to do. But as for me, I know I frequently, in looking at the refrigerator, know what I should do, and yet I do not have the fortitude to abide by the judgment and actually carry it out. So maybe to some extent, temperance is part of this attitude of actually carrying through on wisdom or prudence.
No, that's a very good point. I think that's an important distinction. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
This reminds me of the Vatican saying, which I'm forgetting which number it is, but it's about compulsion, or at least there's two different words used, either necessity or compulsion in how it's translated.
Compulsion is an evil, but there's no compulsion to live under compulsion.
Yes. Yep. So this whole conversation is just totally reminding me about that, which we just talked about that this last Wednesday night as part of the Vatican sayings discussion that we have going every week. But also what came to me is that temperance is sort of a feeling of you're going to stop doing something, whereas prudence is something that you're going to go forward and do. So it's like a positive action, whereas temperance is a kind of a negative stopping. Another thing that came up is nature, not reason, is what sets the limits to desires. I'm not sure if I caught that. But see, there's a whole thing I feel that could be explored in that.
It's that issue of whether these ideas of the virtues, where do they come from? This is the classic argument we have in the country I live in, or the country I should say that most of us here live in, about this issue of rights. Where do rights come from? If your rights don't come from God, then they come from government, is the argument that's often made. It's that same issue with the virtues. Where do they come from? Do they come from the oracle at Delphi? Do they come from the dictator at the head of the Athenian army? Do they come from the priest? Do they come from the philosopher? Where do they come from? And the answer for Epicurus is we learn them from nature, I think is the answer.
But wouldn't this other philosophical schools not trust nature? Somehow that nature is weak, so it couldn't be an adequate source for things like virtue. So reason is somehow above nature. And yet reason occurs within human beings, and human beings are from nature. So then it's this sort of circular argument.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you sort of touched on is that it seems to me, at least, that so many of the other philosophies and religion doesn't trust nature, that nature is something not to be trusted, that we as humans somehow can supersede nature and see what's beyond nature and apply our quote unquote capital R reason to impose our will on nature, and that nature is something to be subjugated and not trusted. And I think that Epicurus takes the exact opposite view of it's like, well, we're part of nature and we're animals too. And so we need to look at, animals and the young and figure out what it's like to be uncorrupted by this veneer of civilization and indoctrination and education that we've imposed on ourselves, and see what we can actually do to find out what is the quote unquote natural way to live.
Yeah, no, I think that was very good, because that's very much what we're talking about, is this whole issue of where does this stuff come from and how can we be sure about it? I was thinking about this quote from Edward Abbey. It's to do with this issue of civilization. And he says in his, I can't remember which book this is in, actually. It might be in his journal or it might be in Desert Solitaire. Anyway, he says, to make the distinction unmistakably clear, civilization is the vital force in human history. Culture is that inert mass of institutions and organizations which accumulate around and tend to drag down the advance of life. Civilization is Giordano Bruno facing death by fire. Culture is the Cardinal Bellarmino after 10 years of Inquisition, sending Bruno to the stake in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome, and he just goes on and on. But this issue of how we connect nature to culture and nature to civilization is one I don't have a good answer to. Epicurus says things like set sail in your little boat and free from all education or culture or whatever he says there.
Yeah, I prefer indoctrination as the translation for that particular word there, but yeah.
I think as we go further, we'll see an answer partly to what Calistini is bringing up, the need for society or for the state. The equivalent of that in Epicurean philosophy is this friendship situation. I think he extends the need of friendship and the support that you get from your friends in much the same way that we would extend. It's not necessarily a formal political organization of a state or a nation or a city or something like that, but it seems clear that he is stressing that you don't live on your own in isolation, sort of the no man is an island position. Mm-hmm. No man is an island, and you must have friends in order not only to live happily, but also to live securely. All those things go hand in hand, and you cannot do this on your own as an isolated individual. And again, since I'm talking about Ayn Rand today, that's really a huge difference. Her individualism, the virtue of selfishness is the name of one of her books. This individualism taken to an extreme is not where Epicurus appears to be going. His focus is on pleasure. His focus is on happiness. Sometimes you do that as an individual. Often you do that as part of a group of friends. It's not focusing on the individual that is going to lead you to happiness. It's focusing on happiness that leads you to happiness.
Yeah, and I think that Epicurus's participation, we've talked about before, his participation in the festivals and the life of the city. He was definitely a part of the city, but I think that his emphasis on not getting involved in the politics and that sort of thing is one of the sort of nuances that he has as far as his relationship to the polis and the city state and the life of the city. He was definitely a part of it. I think we've, at least to my mind, I've established that he wasn't out in the hinterlands of somewhere away from the city. He was on that main thoroughfare and that sort of thing. So he was definitely a part of the city, but he didn't feel the need to get into the weeds and into the dirtiness of politics and things like that to be a part of the life of the city.
Yes, we're now clearly moving into the next subsection on 293, which is entitled Courage. And much of what's just been said applies to this discussion as well. DeWitt says that in Plato's psychology, courage goes with the passionate part of the soul, which should be ruled by the rational part. And to Aristotle, courage is a mean between feelings of fear and of overconfidence. But the focus is on this political setting, and the treatment given to it by Epicurus that DeWitt says he, meaning Epicurus, was no quietist or conscientious objector. Then DeWitt makes the reference to Epicurus submitting himself to the usual military training. I think we've kind of discussed that before. I wish I was aware of something that clearly gave us a reference to that. Does anybody know? Maybe they're just inferring it from the fact that nobody's ever accusing him of failing to do the military service that was required of all Athenians. It's difficult to think of Epicurus carrying a sword and shield and out there on the battlefield, but that doesn't seem far from the likelihood.
Yeah, I don't know what the ancient source would be for that, but I think the general idea is every male of a certain age had to do it. And so is there any evidence that Epicurus was accepted from that requirement? And if not, then do we just assume that he did it like everybody else? And that's where it comes from, I think.
DeWitt says, quote, nor is there any instance on record where an Epicurean refused to bear arms because of his philosophy. I think that's pretty well reasoned because you would almost certainly see it. And to some extent, maybe you do see some general allegations that the Epicureans were not living up to their civic responsibilities. But obviously, you've got the example of Cassius Longinus, who was a general even after becoming an Epicurean. But I think if you did have a pattern of the ancient Epicureans being conscientious objectors as a rule, then you would almost have the same kind of reputation that we have today given to the Amish who refuse to fight. And who's that movie?
The Quakers?
The Quakers, yes. And Gary Cooper played.
Oh, right.
Not important.
Well, there's a recent movie. I don't know. It's not the one you're talking about. Hacksaw Ridge, which was directed by Mel Gibson, has Andrew Garfield in the main role playing a Quaker conscientious objector. Actually, it might have been a Seventh-day Adventist. I think he was a Seventh-day Adventist. He goes to fight in World War II, but he refuses to carry a gun, and he just becomes a combat medic, and he won't hold any weapons in that.
Sergeant York. Sergeant York is the one I was trying to remember.
Yeah, I was looking through my notes whenever I had started to try and go through the Nicomachean Ethics, which I have not gotten back to. But I find Aristotle's quote, because I think we sometimes give more credit to Plato and Aristotle and think that, we talk about them as having these vaunted ideas and stuff. That in the section where Aristotle starts to talk about courage, he writes, "The courageous man, then, is he that endures or fears the right things and for the right purpose and in the right manner and at the right time, and who shows confidence in a similar way. For the courageous man feels and acts as the circumstances merit and as principles may dictate." And it seems to me that trying to define something by enduring or fearing the right things for the right purpose in the right manner at the right time, it's like, well, who decides which is the right manner and the right way and the right time? It just seems to go on and on in that section in the Nicomachean Ethics, that it's so generic and so contextual. And so, we'll define this when it's convenient for us. It seems to me it's almost meaningless whenever he talks in roundabout ways like this. And the sections that I've read that Aristotle wrote does not really impress me that much, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Everybody talks about the mean and the middle way and two extremes and this kind of thing, but the way Aristotle describes these things, it's so wishy-washy and so contextual, it just borders on almost meaningless as far as I can see. And I guess the more vague and more sort of generic that you talk about, then you can say, oh yeah, well it applies in that case, and you bring up another case, oh yeah, well it applies there too. Well, it doesn't apply here, but it applies over here. And it just seems it's just so roundabout way of trying to describe these things and define them that it's like I said, almost meaningless.
Let me see if it's profitable here to look into ancient Greece's oldest coward, if we could do that for a minute.
Yes.
This comes from the Iliad, and it's a character in the Iliad named Thersites. Thersites was badly deformed. He was like a hunchback. His head came to a point. It's kind of a connection between deformity and moral ugliness in some of these old societies. Anyway, I'm reading here from about line 270 in the first book, and it says, "The Grecians with contempt listened, and indignation, while with voice at highest pitch, he thus the monarch mocked." This is Thersites speaking now. He says, "What wouldst thou now? Whereof is thy complaint now, Agamemnon? Thou hast filled thy tents with treasure, and the Grecians, when they take a city, choose the loveliest girls for thee. Is gold thy wish? More gold? A ransom brought by some chief Trojan for his son's relief, whom I or other valiant Greeks may bind? Or wouldst thou yet a virgin, one by right, another's claim, but made by force thine own? It was not well, great sir, that thou shouldst bring a plague on the Achaeans as of late. But come, my Grecian sisters, soldiers named unfitly of a sex too soft for war. Come, let us homeward. Let him, Agamemnon, here digest what he shall gorge, alone, that he may learn if our assistance profit him or not. For when he shamed Achilles, he disgraced a chief far worthier than himself, whose prize he now withholds. But tush, Achilles lacks himself the spirit of a man. No gall hath he within him, or his hand long since had stopped that mouth, that it should scoff no more." And immediately they all shout him down like he's the world's biggest idiot. He's a coward. He's a fool. And the theory goes in modern scholarship that this is Homer piling his own opinion, his own apprehension about this misguided war onto the worst character in the book, and then sort of driving him out of the story entirely so he doesn't have to deal with it again. But this is sort of the character for cowardice in Greek culture, making some very excellent points, right?
With part of the point being, Joshua, that even though esteemed to be so courageous and bold in war, that the real result of his actions in attempting to extend his conquest so far was to end up with basically the destruction of Greece itself?
Bear in mind, the Iliad doesn't start at the beginning of the war. The Iliad starts in the middle of the 10th year of the war. So they have been at war now for 10 years with Troy. And his argument here is we're here with Agamemnon. He wants more gold. He wants more women. He wants more power, more riches, more fame. But what does that do for literally any of the rest of us? You know, we have homes, we have farms, we have wives and children back home in Greece. Why are we not allowed, after 10 years of war getting nowhere, to go back home? That's the question.
He sounds practical to me. It's like, yeah.
Joshua, is it Croesus? Croesus was the king who ended up launching a war himself, and he went to the oracle and asked the oracle what was going to happen, and the oracle said a great power will be destroyed. And in the end, he loses the war, and the joke is that the oracle was right, that a great power was destroyed. But it was not his enemy, it was Croesus himself. If I got that totally wrong.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's right.
You're right. In fact, Lucian, in that story of Alexander, compares one of the oracles of Alexander to that oracle. Alexander had told Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, that he's going to win a great victory, and all they have to do is throw 2 lions into a river as a sacrifice, and then they're going to win a great battle. And then they throw the 2 lions into the river. The lions swim to the other bank, and the Gauls or Germans or whatever beat them to death with clubs. and then they do the same to the Romans.
And so our point is that courage can be foolhardiness or can lead to very negative results if it's not properly employed.
Exactly. And I think holding, again, this is one of those ones where I think if you hold, capital C courage up as this thing where everybody has to do something specific, that even Aristotle himself talked about how contextual it is and how, it all depends, what the circumstances are and all of that. It's just, it's one of those things where if you try and hold up these virtues, in and of themselves as some sort of ideal, that it's like, well, what does that even mean? And I think that people try and make you feel you're doing something wrong if you even question that sort of idea, that well, how dare you question the virtue of courage? Well, what do you mean by the virtue of courage? What does that actually mean? Well, it means what it means. That sort of line of, quote unquote reasoning.
DeWitt has a lot of good information here in this relatively short section on courage. Let's plan to wrap this section up as the end of our podcast today. And as we go forward in this section at the bottom of 293, DeWitt relates that Epicurus had said that nothing terrible can happen to one while living who has thoroughly grasped the truth that there's nothing terrible in not living. And DeWitt relates that to one of the principal doctrines, the same argument that assures us of nothing terrible lasting forever or even very long, discerns the protection afforded by friendship in this brief life of ours as being the most dependable as all. And basically where DeWitt is going here, and unfortunately, we'll try to look this up and put it in the thread for today. At the top of 294, there's a statement quoted, "Courage comes not by nature, but by a calculation of advantage," which DeWitt is saying is sort of a second-hand report of something that Epicurus had said. We need to look up to see where that comes from before we put too much stock in it. But the bottom line of a lot of this is that, as with everything else, we're looking at the ultimate, even if not in terms of time, we're looking at the ultimate result of a particular action and judging whether something is courageous or not by the ultimate result of it, as opposed to just some abstract notion that we should always be courageous. We instead look to determine whether being courageous in a particular situation is going to lead to the result that we're hoping to have. Because if it doesn't, then it would be foolhardy to pursue something if you know it's going to lead to the wrong result. The closing paragraph here is that Epicurus, while leaving undisturbed the concept of courage as a virtue of the citizen and the soldier, transfers the responsibility for developing it from the state and from the laws to the individual himself, and shifts the emphasis from the sphere of politics to that of morals. And it may be added also that what we call moral courage will appear in a following section as an aspect of honesty. We'll deal with that in probably the next episode next week. So let's bring today's thoughts to a conclusion and go around the table and see if we have any additional thoughts on virtue in general or the virtues that we've covered today, which are wisdom, temperance, and courage. Martin, any thoughts?
No, sorry, I have nothing to add in.
Okay, Calasini?
Yes, this is very interesting discussing the virtues, and I think it's a good place to try to bring in some practical applications of Epicureanism. And so it's something to think about how our understanding of virtues affects us.
Yeah, we all, I think, agree that Epicurus was all about putting what we know from philosophy into practical action in our lives. And so I think seeing those things, even though we're talking about war and Hellenistic civilization and education stuff, that I think all of these have practical applications to how we live our lives today. And it's one of those things that I think that we try and do in the forum is to bring that to the fore.
Yes, Calasini, I know your interest goes especially to therapeutics and different techniques for living more happily. And even though the title of this chapter has the word virtue in it, which doesn't seem to be so practical, I really think that when you back up and you realize that the big controversy here is the Stoics say that virtue is an end in itself, but Epicurus says that virtue is a tool for the achievement of happiness. When you think about the word tool, these are here the categories in which Epicurus himself is discussing whatever therapeutic or other suggestions he's making to people. DeWitt's already mentioned that to some extent the issue of the natural and necessary desires falls probably under this issue of temperance. So while these titles may seem to be Victorian in the way we're talking about them because we're placing it in context of Plato and Aristotle, what we're really talking about here are these techniques that you should cultivate in your normal daily life for the achievement of happy living. That's what so many people are interested in. So we've got some material here that has a lot of significance to it. But next, Don.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting discussion to have. And while you mentioned that DeWitt sometimes his wording is a bit odd, I think it's good that he brings up these individual virtues that we can think about. And I keep coming back, I think, in this discussion to the idea that we don't want to see the virtues as the capital V virtues or the capital W wisdom, that we want to think of them as practical applications of our daily lives and living the most pleasurable life that we can. And as the principal doctrine says about you can't live pleasurably without living virtuously, and you can't live virtuously without living happily.
Joshua?
Yeah, those are all very good points. And, when I was in college, I went to Rome one summer and we were in the Roman Forum, or what's left of it. And the tour guide pointed to an unremarkable hole in the ground and said, and this is the Lacus Curtius, I think is the thing. And the story goes that, I think it's reported in Livy, that in ancient Rome, a chasm opened up in the Roman Forum and it continued to widen and expand. And so they asked the oracle what they should do to close the chasm. And the oracle said, throw the most precious thing you have into the chasm and that will close it. And so people are bringing their jewels, their gold and silver and ivory and all this precious material and throwing it into the chasm. And the chasm's just getting wider and wider. And finally, a young Roman man on a horse says, Romans, you've lost sight of the main point. The most precious thing Rome has is brave men. And on his horse and in a full suit of armor, he goes riding off into the chasm, which then closes, and then a spring was created on the spot and so forth. I mention that because Cicero says somewhere, he says, I believe the souls of men are immortal, and I would not have this belief taken from me while I was still alive. This whole issue of how we confront the issue of the certainty of our own mortality, and the idea, which Epicurus is likewise certain about, which is that there's nothing beyond that there's an element of courage required to confront that and still live well. That to me seems to be an important point on this issue of courage specifically, but the virtues in general.
Good points, Joshua. Let me close this episode today by quoting back from Torquatus again in Book 1. Quote, those who place the chief good in virtue alone are beguiled by the glamour of a name and do not understand the true demands of nature. If they will consent to listen to Epicurus, they will be delivered from the grossest error. Your school dilates on the transcendent beauty of the virtues, but were they not productive of pleasure, who would deem them either praiseworthy or desirable? We esteem the art of medicine not for its interest as a science, but for its conduciveness to health. The art of navigation is commended for its practical and not its scientific value, because it conveys the rules for sailing a ship with success. So also wisdom must be considered the art of living. If it effected no result, it would not be desired. But as it is desired because it is the artificer that procures and produces pleasure. Okay, that's the first of our episodes on the new virtues. We'll come back in a week and we will start with justice. Thanks for your time today. Please drop by the forum and let us know if you have any comments or questions, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.